Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're well today. Today we're going to continue with our little series on how INFJs see insert a certain type, and today we're going to be talking about ENFJs, how INFJs see ENFJs. You'll see this is hopefully going to be an interesting video, so stick around. But before that, remember that if you want to know more about INFJs, if you are interested in digging deep, you can get my book, The Ecstatic Soul, available at the links below. Amazon links, less than €10, $10. Good reviews, check it out. And there's also my pretty new novel, The Infinite Castle. If you can support the channel, if you're into fiction, if you're interested in the idea of an INFJ main character, also check it out. You can also support me on Patreon, really support the channel. Thank you very much to my supporters and future ones, hopefully. ENFJs are... first of all, it's interesting to mention that ENFJs were one of the first types I thought about, with this series. I always think about INTJs, INFPs, and ENFJs first. And I think one of the reasons is because you'll notice that with ISFJs, there are the four types that have at least 3 letters in common with INFJs. ENFJs have NFJ in common, INTJs have INJ in common, ISFJs have IFJ in common, and so on and so forth. INFPs have INF in common. And yet, if you look at these 4 types, which you could, on the basis of those letters, could describe as the closest cousins of the INFJ. Of course, if you look a little bit closer, in terms of pure functional relationship, it's undeniable that the ENFJ is the closest cousin, and INFJs will often be a little bit reticent to admit that or to agree to that, which is an interesting fact in itself, and we will explore it in a little bit of detail. Often, if you probe INFJs, this is something that I've observed. So among these 4 types, the closest cousin that they tend to acknowledge. I'm speaking obviously of general averages of how INFJ sees things. There's always going to be INFJs who don't see things this way, but if you think in terms of trends, in terms of ratios, INTJs will be the closest cousin that they admit, that they acknowledge. I think that on the whole, they are quite ahead in terms of being seen as the closest cousin. Then it is kind of a debate between, I think, there's also ISTPs that INFJs see as close cousins, and they're not entirely wrong, by the way, because ISTPs actually share the same functions with INFJs. They're closer to INFJs than one may think, but you obviously have to overcome the sensor divide. ISFJ is very different, and not a lot of INFJs see ISFJs as cousins because of SI, DOM, and so on. ENFJs and INFPs probably about the same. I mean, INFJs tend to see ENFJs as closer to INFPs, but somehow they tend to, I think, interact more with INFPs than with ENFJs. There's also a lot of INFPs that INFJs find frustrating and very different, but same with ENFJs. ENFJs are, they're not often mentioned, if you like, they're acknowledged as a cousin. But first of all, they're not acknowledged as the most prominent cousin, the closest cousin by far. Usually that privilege goes to the INTJ. And second of all, when they are acknowledged, because they are ultimately, the INFJ tends to be quick to say, yes, indeed. However, they are clearly very much extroverted version. And we don't have the shortcomings that they have. I mean, I'm slightly exaggerating things, but you get my point. There is this, I've seen that very often, like you'll have a handful of INFJs who'll say, oh, ENFJ is great, they're extroverted, they can accomplish things and so on. But you still will get a lot of INFJs who will say, yeah, ENFJs, they can, they achieve things, they're productive, they're out in the world, they're, proactive more than we are, but, they're a little bit superficial compared to us. And they are not as subtle in terms of psychological profiling as we are. Partly because when you're dominating or you're leading with FE, you tend first to think in terms of what you want the others to be like or to do, including what's good for them according to how you conceive of things. You don't necessarily put yourself in their shoes first, you know. In fact, this is often something that FI dominants are better at, you know, putting yourself in other people's shoes. However, because there is this process where like they really put themselves in other people's shoes, they tend to refrain from giving prescriptions or advice because they sense as if what the other person needs is so individual to them that they couldn't even begin to think of what they could say, which sometimes comes across as, you know, INFPs or SFPs not getting involved and being selfish or, you know, being non-committal in terms of helping others. But sometimes it's because they respect the integrity of the person's individuality so much that they don't know where they would even begin. In some sense, the ENFJ is the opposite. They're very proactive. So if you need support, emotional support, you know, like they will be there and they'll really, really help you and lift you up. The downside is that often they won't have as much subtlety and acuity of defining your unique identity needs as INFPs would, but without the proactivity to help you. And INFJs would, with a little bit of proactivity to help you, but not as much as the ENFJ. And INFJ will like more of their, they like more of their alone time, of course, and they're very mindful of the resources, their own energy resources when it comes to helping others. So I think that this view that the INFJs, a lot of INFJs anyway, have of the ENFJ as being not as psychologically acute and subtle, and of being a little shallower in terms of seeking others' approval and so on. There might be an element of truth to that somewhere, but I think it's greatly exaggerated. And I would venture to say that this is a reflection or a projection of a certain kind of envy that INFJs experience about ENFJs, because INFJs, you know, and the Ecstatic Soul, my book on the INFJ, talks about it. You know, the key to many ways, the key to INFJs de-alienation consists in being able to channel the FE function. And of course, they're faced with a cousin that has the same functions as them, almost in the same hierarchy, with just a little bit of displacement. So very close cousin, closer than any other cousin, who are able to channel FE just by their very nature. So they can, by definition, do those things naturally that INFJs struggle to achieve to do. And when they do manage them, it's through great effort, self-overcoming in some ways. And sometimes they never quite manage to get there. So they see someone who's like very closely connected to them, they can feel it, but that person just does that naturally. Of course, there's going to be some envy and a little bit of typological jealousy, if you know what I mean, which can lead INFJs to sometimes exaggerate, excuse me for a second, yeah, it can lead INFJ to sometimes exaggerate the shortcomings of the ENFJs. At least it's something I've experienced. And again, when I say I've experienced this, I've experienced those kind of biases in other people, but I'm also speaking of my own experience, you know, and my dad is an ENFJ, and certainly sometimes I see in him flaws that I've described in this video, but there's other times where I'm like, oh God, if I could have a bit more of that natural outgrowth of FE, you know. So closer cousin than we would like to admit, by far the closest cousin, in fact, much closer than the INTJ. Come on, INTJs have T and FI. That's not an INFJ thing at all. The ENFJs have all their functions. Sure, their TI is inferior. You know, that can be a source of frustration for us, and there lies some difference. But it's still, they still are by far our closest cousins, and we have much to find inspiring in them. And hopefully they have much to find inspiring in us. Anyway, let me know in the comments what you think of ENFJs. If you agree with me, disagree with me, how and why. Don't forget to buy my Patreon page. It really helps. Okay, see you next week, guys. Take care.